in 1845 in the quiet rolling hills of Pennsylvania. Whispers began to spread through taverns, farmhouses, and church pews. The story was always told in hushed tones, never loudly, as though to raise one's voice might invite the curse itself. A surgeon had arrived in town well-dressed, educated, with hands steady enough to earn the trust of the sick and desperate. But not long after his practice began, people noticed something deeply unsettling. Patients walked into his care and never came out again. It is here that our story begins, an unsettling tale stitched together from rumor, fragments of testimony, and forgotten records that few dared to preserve. If you love dark, forgotten history, consider subscribing to this channel for more stories that history itself tried to bury. And before we plunge into the shadows, let me ask, where are you watching this from? And what time is it right now? Share it below, because timing and place often change how these stories settle in our bones. The doctor had appeared in town without much introduction. His name was known, though always spoken with a kind of reservation, as if people weren't certain they should say it aloud. He claimed to have studied medicine in Philadelphia, perhaps even abroad, but no one could confirm his credentials. His clinic was small, just a room in a converted farmhouse at the edge of the woods, where the path narrowed and the shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally. At first, he was welcomed. This was a rural community, far from any major city, and the nearest established hospital was many miles away. A surgeon who could set bones, stitch wounds, or treat fever was a blessing. Families brought their children, their sickly parents, their farm injuries. The doctor seemed compassionate, but perhaps too quiet, too clinical in his demeanor. He did not linger in conversation. His eyes seemed always to weigh and measure, as if reducing people to flesh and anatomy rather than neighbors or friends. Within weeks, unease crept in. A woman who had suffered a difficult childbirth was carried to his door. He promised to relieve her suffering. The family waited. The night stretched on. Lantern light flickered in the windows, but morning came with no word. When they knocked, the doctor told them she had passed in the night an unfortunate tragedy. But he did not allow them to see her body, claiming it was already prepared. They left bewildered, uneasy, but too poor and powerless to protest. Another case followed a young man injured in a logging accident. Strong, resilient, and full of life, he was taken to the surgeon for an operation to repair his shattered leg. Days later, when his brothers came to inquire, the doctor told them their kin had succumbed to fever. Again, no body was returned, no burial arranged, only a vague explanation that the remains were not suitable for viewing. Rumors ignited. In a small town, news travels like wildfire. But in this case, the fire burned strangely cold. People spoke quietly in corners of the churchyard. Some said they had seen lanterns burning through the night in his home. Others swore they heard muffled screams carried on the wind, followed by silence that was even more frightening. One boy claimed he had seen the doctor dragging heavy bundles toward the woods, but when pressed, he fell silent, as though he feared punishment for speaking further. What made the story even more chilling was the lack of closure. In rural Pennsylvania, death was no stranger. People buried loved ones, mourned them in ritual, and placed markers to remember. But here, there were no graves. Families were left with nothing, no body, no ceremony, only the gnawing suspicion that something unspeakable had happened behind the surgeon's door. Why, then, did no one confront him openly? Perhaps it was fear. The mid-19th century was a time when medicine itself carried a sense of sorcery. Ordinary people did not fully understand surgery, anesthesia, or anatomy. A man who could cut into flesh and claim to heal seemed to hold power both sacred and dangerous. To accuse him without proof risked not only humiliation but retaliation from a man who seemed to know more about the human body than anyone else in the valley. There was also the unsettling truth that some villagers wanted to believe in him. Hope is a powerful sedative. For those desperate to save a loved one, denial was easier than suspicion. It was more comfortable to say, "He tried, but it failed," than to whisper, "He took them." Still, the doubts festered, growing darker with each unexplained disappearance. By the end of that first year, the number of missing had risen beyond coincidence. The exact count was not yet whispered aloud, but families kept mental tallies. A daughter here, a brother there, a father who never returned. Those who noticed began to avert their eyes when passing the surgeon on the road. He walked calmly, carrying his medical bag, nodding politely, but something about his gaze made mothers clutch their children closer. It was during this time that the name the disappearing surgeon began to take hold. Not openly, of course, never shouted in the market square, but muttered when no outsiders could hear. People spoke of him as though he were a curse that had descended upon their valley, a shadow in human form. Yet no one dared move against him, and so the silence stretched on. The surgeon continued his work, undisturbed, while fear grew like mold in the minds of the townsfolk. They wondered, though few dared to ask aloud what truly happened inside that dimly lit room, what became of the bodies that were never returned. And perhaps most chilling, why did he never allow families to see the remains of their dead? The story had only begun, and already the air was heavy with dread. The surgeon's shadow loomed over Pennsylvania, and 37 vanished souls waited in silence, their fate hidden behind walls no one dared breach. The town's uneasy silence did not come all at once. It crept in slowly, like fog drifting between the ridges, until people realized that conversations had shortened. Doors were locked earlier, and children were hushed whenever the surgeon's name arose. In 1845 Pennsylvania, community survived through mutual trust. Neighbors leaned on neighbors. Gossip served as both entertainment and warning, and secrets rarely lasted long. Yet here was a growing shadow that no one wanted to confront directly. Farmers returning from the fields would pass by the surgeon's house and deliberately look away, focusing on their horses' reins or the dirt road beneath them. Women on their porches stopped rocking in their chairs if his figure appeared at a distance. At church, where hymns once rose proudly, voices faltered if he entered, though he often sat alone, hands clasped, listening more than participating. The silence around him became as thick as stone walls, protecting him from questions, yet isolating him as something other, something dangerous. Why was the community so quiet? Fear is only one answer. In those days, doctors, even those with questionable credentials, were seen as near magicians. They cut open flesh, stitched it back, and claimed dominion over life and death. To accuse such a man was to accuse knowledge itself, to put oneself against the tide of modern progress. And what if he truly was innocent, only cursed with bad fortune? A single accusation could destroy reputations, leaving the accuser branded as a hysteric or slanderer. But beneath that silence, tension simmered. Families of the missing began to avoid one another, as if gathering in solidarity might invite more scrutiny or worse vengeance. A widow whose daughter had vanished was seen weeping at the edge of the churchyard, but when approached, she quickly wiped her eyes and insisted she was fine. A father who had lost a son stopped attending Sunday service entirely, retreating into his barn for hours on end. No one comforted them openly. Grief was swallowed whole, transformed into private suffering. And then there were the small, unsettling details people noticed but never spoke aloud. One night, a neighbor swore he saw lamplight flickering behind the surgeon's upstairs curtains long after midnight. Another insisted he heard a scream carried faintly on the wind, cut off abruptly, followed by silence so complete it chilled his marrow. Children dared each other to sneak near the surgeon's home, only to run back pale-faced, muttering about shadows moving where no one should have been. Each story alone could be dismissed, but together they formed a tapestry of unease too disturbing to ignore. The local pastor attempted to address it once in vague terms. His sermon turned to themes of hidden sin and unseen corruption, warning that evil often dressed itself in garments of good. Parishioners shifted uncomfortably, casting furtive glances toward the back pew where the surgeon sat, unmoved, expression unreadable. But when the service ended, no one approached him, no one confronted him. Instead, they filed out in silence, as though a spell had been cast over their tongues. Still, questions gnawed at the town. Why were there never funerals for his patients? Why were families denied the simple comfort of burying their dead? The surgeon always had explanations: rapid decay, illness too contagious, or remains already disposed of for the good of the living. These answers were never challenged. They were accepted with bowed heads and murmured thanks, though in private. Suspicion festered. As weeks turned into months, silence evolved into complicity. Neighbors avoided discussing the surgeon not only out of fear, but also because speaking of him seemed to make the air colder, the nights longer. People convinced themselves it was better not to know, and yet everyone knew enough. The silence was not ignorance, it was surrender. What does it mean when a community collectively chooses to bury its fear? Was it cowardice or survival? Was the surgeon truly untouchable? Or had the townsfolk simply given him permission through their silence? These are the questions that echo through history, unanswered, like footsteps in an empty corridor. By autumn, the surgeon's practice remained busy, though not with locals. Strangers came, farmhands from neighboring counties, a pregnant woman traveling with her mother, even a wandering peddler who injured himself on the road. They were welcomed, treated, and, some say, never seen again. For the townsfolk, this brought a twisted relief. If outsiders disappeared, perhaps the danger would not turn inward again. Perhaps the surgeon would feed on others, sparing their own families. It was a dark bargain. Unspoken but understood: do not interfere, and perhaps we will be safe. Yet safety is never guaranteed when silence reigns. Rumors began to spread beyond the valley, whispered along trading routes and into distant towns. There's a doctor in Pennsylvania, some said, whose patients vanish. Others claimed he was building something in secret, collecting knowledge or flesh for purposes unspeakable. But when travelers asked the townsfolk directly, they smiled too quickly, denied too firmly, and directed questions elsewhere. The silence was so consistent that it became its own strange evidence. As the year drew to its close, the air of dread was undeniable. Winter settled over Pennsylvania, and with it came long nights where the surgeon's windows glowed faintly against the snow. Villagers stayed indoors, clutching candles, whispering prayers. They no longer asked, "What is he doing?" instead. They asked, "When will it end?" The surgeon remained, calm and deliberate, untouched by the unease he created. He continued to walk the streets with his black medical bag, tipping his hat politely, speaking in soft, measured tones. But beneath that facade, the town's silence was his greatest shield, and each day, with every unspoken word, his shadow deepened until it felt less like one man's actions and more like the valley itself had fallen under a dark enchantment. What would finally break this silence, and what horrors would spill out once tongues began to loosen? The first missing patient, whose story truly shook the town, was a young woman named Eliza Harper. She was only 21, a daughter of one of the more respected farming families, known for her bright laughter and a singing voice that often carried through the church choir. In the late summer of 1845, she began suffering from a fever that left her too weak to walk. Her family, desperate for help, turned to the surgeon. Though whispers already hung about him, what choice did they have? No one else in the valley claimed the skill to save her. Eliza was carried to his door on a wagon, wrapped in quilts, her face pale but her eyes still flickering with hope. Her mother kissed her forehead before the surgeon appeared. Tall and thin, his dark coat buttoned neatly despite the heat of the evening. He assured them calmly that Eliza would be well cared for, that her chances were very favorable. With that, the family left her in his care, believing they would see her again within days. But they never did. When her mother returned the next morning to check on her, the surgeon met her at the door with a grave expression. He spoke in low tones, telling her that Eliza's condition had worsened unexpectedly during the night and that she had succumbed to the fever before dawn. Stunned, the mother asked to see her daughter, to touch her one last time. The surgeon's refusal was firm. His reasoning cloaked in clinical detachment. The fever was of a kind that made the body unsafe for viewing. He said it had advanced quickly, and in the interest of public health, he had already seen to the disposal of her remains. The mother staggered back, half mad with grief, but she was powerless to argue. She returned home without her child, without even a lock of hair or a body to bury. Word spread quickly. Eliza Harper was gone. But something did not add up. A neighbor swore he had seen blood-stained linens hanging outside the surgeon's rear window that morning, flapping in the breeze. Another claimed they heard muffled cries in the night, cries that could not have come from a woman slipping into unconsciousness, but from someone very much awake and terrified. These fragments did not fit the surgeon's story. The Harpers, though heartbroken, dared not press further. To accuse a doctor of deception was to risk public shame, even ruin. Instead, they kept their suspicions quiet, whispering only to close friends. Yet Eliza's absence lingered, a hollow place in the choir, a missing chair at Sunday supper, and in that silence, fear thickened across the valley. Eliza was not the only one. Soon after, another case arose, this time a man named Thomas Bell, a sturdy logger with arms like oak trunks. He had injured his leg in a sawing accident, a deep gash that left bone exposed. He was taken to the surgeon's house, groaning with pain. His brothers stayed outside, listening as the hours passed. They swore they heard the whine of a saw long after the surgeon claimed the operation was finished. By morning, Thomas was gone. The explanation was the same infection. Sudden decline, remains unsuitable for return. And yet, no graves were dug. No coffins were carried to the cemetery. It was as though the patients vanished into smoke. That was when the community began noticing the small, unsettling traces left behind. A butcher in town claimed he saw the surgeon purchasing large quantities of lime, far more than one man would ever need. Lime, as many knew, could dissolve flesh. Another villager described strange stains in the snow outside his cellar door come winter, dark patches that seeped into the white ground. Still, these were observations left unspoken, traded only in the safety of closed barns or whispered after church. Was it fear of retaliation that silenced them, or something deeper? Perhaps the truth was more disturbing. Some did not want to know. It was easier to believe in tragedy than to confront the possibility of deliberate horror. Yet the pattern was undeniable. A patient entered his house, a death was declared. A body was never seen again. Eliza's case haunted the town more than the others because she was young, vibrant, and beloved. People remembered her voice. They remembered how she laughed, how she braided ribbons into her hair on Sundays. The thought that she had simply vanished without proof, without burial, gnawed at their souls. And it planted a question too dark to ignore. If Eliza could disappear, who might be next? Parents grew more protective of their daughters. Husbands thought twice before sending their wives to the surgeon. But at the same time, sickness and accidents were inevitable. When no other healer could be found, people still found themselves at his door, hearts pounding, bargaining with their own fear. What truly happened to Eliza Harper? Did fever claim her in truth? Her body discarded by a surgeon too clinical for compassion? Or did something far more sinister occur that night within those walls? Some swore her cries had been real, that she had been awake when the scalpel touched her. Others whispered that she was not dead at all, that she had been taken. Alive, for purposes no one dared to name. And so the town carried on, balancing unease with necessity, but Eliza's disappearance marked a turning point. The surgeon's reputation shifted, no longer merely a man of medicine, but a figure shrouded in suspicion. Behind every polite nod on the street, behind every quiet greeting, lurked the chilling thought this man holds secrets we may never uncover. Her absence was only the beginning. She was the first thread pulled from the fabric of the community, leaving a hole that widened with each passing month. Soon there would be others, many others. By the turn of winter, the disappearances could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. There was now a discernible pattern, a grim arithmetic that everyone in the valley carried silently in their minds. A young woman here, a logger there, an old farmer who went for treatment and never came home. Each case followed the same haunting sequence. The surgeon accepted the patient. Neighbors noted lamplight burning through the night. Then news spread by morning of a sudden decline, an unexpected death. And always the same explanation: no body returned, no burial permitted. It was a rhythm as chilling as the toll of a church bell. At first, each incident was met with grief and whispered prayers. But by the third or fourth disappearance, people began to see the repetitions. The excuses were too neat, the details too rehearsed. Yet, when suspicion flared, it was quickly smothered beneath silence. Confrontation never came, only sidelong glances and muttered oaths in private. The surgeon's practice continued, untouched, while the list of missing grew. There were families who asked questions more boldly than others. One such family belonged to Samuel Yates, a respected mill worker whose teenage son, Caleb, had fallen ill with a lung infection. Caleb was taken to the surgeon's home in hopes of recovery. 2 days later, Samuel was told his son had succumbed. Unlike the others, Samuel demanded to see the body. He stood firm on his porch, fists clenched, as the surgeon tried to explain. "You must understand," the doctor murmured. The boy's condition left him unsuitable for viewing. Samuel refused to yield. But after a tense silence, the surgeon's gaze grew cold. His voice dropped into something almost reptilian. "For your family's sake, let this matter rest." Samuel returned home shaken, anger battling fear inside him. He never pressed further, and soon his grief consumed him. Caleb was gone, and his father was left hollowed out, like so many others. The repetition itself became a form of terror. It was not simply the vanishing patients, but the way the community adapted. Every time a new disappearance occurred, the town absorbed it like a bruise, painful but concealed. Mothers wept quietly at night. Fathers buried their anger in work. And always, the surgeon moved calmly through the streets, untouched by suspicion, his black medical bag swinging at his side like a pendulum, counting the beats of an unseen clock. Some villagers began to keep count. They did not say the number aloud, but they wrote it in the margins of Bibles, or scratched it into barn beams. Tally marks carved by trembling hands. One widow was said to keep a strip of cloth in her cupboard, adding a stitch for every lost soul. By late winter, the count stood at more than a dozen. The number itself became an unspeakable curse. People knew it, but no one dared to confirm it publicly. And then came the travelers' outsiders who, ignorant of the whispers, sought the surgeon's help. A peddler from Ohio with a festering wound. A woman from across the county suffering from seizures. Each time, the story repeated. Outsiders vanished as surely as the townsfolk. Some said this was even worse. for it meant the surgeon's reach extended beyond the valley. If strangers disappeared without consequence, what protection did locals truly have? Rumors grew wilder. Some believed he was selling bodies to medical colleges in Philadelphia, where cadavers were in high demand for dissection. Others whispered of occult practices, that the surgeon sought knowledge forbidden by God, experimenting in secret on still-living flesh. A few muttered about debts to forces darker than man-packs sealed with blood. But in the absence of proof, these whispers never became accusations. They remained stories traded at the edges of fields, as fragile as candlelight against the dark, and always there was the question of sound. Many swore they had heard noises in the night, muffled cries, the clatter of instruments, and once a chilling scream that rose and cut off abruptly, like a bird struck from the sky. Dogs in the valley barked without reason on those nights. Hackles raised towards the surgeon's home, yet when dawn came, the surgeon appeared as calm as ever, nodding politely to neighbors, his windows shuttered, his secrets intact. The weight of silence pressed harder with each disappearance. The town, once lively with songs and laughter, grew muted. Children played less in the fields, and when they did, their parents called them inside at the first hint of dusk. Even the church seemed changed, prayers shorter, hymns quieter, as if the congregation feared that even God might abandon them if they spoke too loudly of what plagued their valley. But the silence also carried a question that refused to die: how many had already vanished, and how many more would follow? The pattern had become undeniable, and with each new tally mark, the shadow lengthened. What happens when a community sees the truth, yet chooses not to act? Was the surgeon's power truly that great? Or had fear itself become the true master of Pennsylvania's quiet hills? The count was growing, and though no one dared admit it aloud, everyone knew Eliza Harper had not been the first, and she would not be the last. The surgeon's home itself became a character in the unfolding dread. Locals began calling it, in whispers, the House of Shadows. It was an unremarkable farmhouse when viewed from the road: white clapboard siding, dark shutters, and a roof that sagged slightly at one end. Yet, to those who lived nearby, it radiated something more than timber and stone. The very air around it felt colder. The trees along its property line seemed twisted, their branches clawing toward the sky. Horses balked at its gate, refusing to pass after dusk. Neighbors told of flickering lamplight at impossible hours. Sometimes 3 or 4 lamps glowed at once, their yellow eyes shining through the curtains like watchful sentinels. At other times, only a single light burned faintly in the attic window. Long after midnight, as if someone studied or dissected in solitude, shadows moved across those panes in unnatural rhythms, jerking, halting, then vanishing altogether. Who or what was making them? No one dared to find out. Stranger still were the noises. On stormy nights, when thunder rolled and wind lashed against the valley, people swore they heard something carried across the dark metallic clinks, dragging sounds, and muffled cries that rose to a pitch of terror before cutting off as suddenly as lightning. One farmer described it as the sound of life being smothered. Dogs howled and cowered, refusing to leave their pens. Chickens stirred restlessly. It was as though the earth itself recoiled from whatever occurred behind those shuttered windows. Yet the most unsettling detail was the surgeon's composure. He walked through town by day, greeting people in his measured, polite way. He purchased bread, visited the apothecary, and even offered kind words at funerals, though, curiously, never the funerals of his own patients, for they had none. He seemed unaffected by the rumors, unshaken by the eyes that avoided his. If anything, his calm grew stronger, like a man shielded by knowledge too vast for others to understand. Some townsfolk speculated that he had altered the house itself. A delivery boy once glimpsed the interior when dropping off parcels and swore he saw doors that led nowhere. strange locks on cellar doors, and a heavy odor of chemicals that clung to the walls. The boy told his parents, but they silenced him quickly, fearing reprisal. Still, the image spread rooms that bent reality, doors that swallowed people whole, staircases that spiraled into darkness. Others claimed to have seen him digging in the garden by moonlight, shovel striking earth with deliberate rhythm. When asked, he explained he was preparing soil for medicinal herbs. Yet no plants ever grew there. Instead, the ground remained churned and uneven, as though disturbed too often. Some whispered that bones lay beneath, hidden under layers of dirt and lime. But no one dared to dig. The House of Shadows became both a warning and a fascination. Children dared each other to approach its fence, to touch the iron gate and run back before the surgeon appeared. One boy claimed he saw pale faces staring from the windows, faces that vanished when he blinked. His friends laughed nervously, but none dared repeat the experiment. The house loomed, watching, a silent accomplice to whatever horrors unfolded inside. And still, the townsfolk did nothing. Fear bound them tighter than any lock. What could they say that noises in the night and flickering lights proved murder, that shadows seen from a distance confirmed abomination? They lacked evidence, and so they carried on. Yet, with each passing week, the house grew heavier in their imaginations, pressing against their dreams, seeping into their prayers. A schoolteacher, writing in her private diary, described walking past the house one late evening after visiting a sick relative. She swore she heard not just a voice, but many whispers rising from beneath the ground, weaving together like a choir of the damned. She ran home trembling, burned the page after writing it, and never again walked that road alone. But perhaps the strangest thing of all was how the surgeon himself seemed to draw strength from the silence. The more people avoided his gaze, the straighter he walked. The fewer questions asked, the bolder his steps became. His house did not merely contain shadows, it thrived on them, feeding on the unspoken terror of the valley. And so the farmhouse transformed from a dwelling into a symbol. It was no longer just a place where the surgeon lived, but a manifestation of the town's paralysis, their collective refusal to act. Every time its shutters closed, every time a lantern flickered in its windows, the valley was reminded of its own helplessness. Yet, deep down, all who passed it wondered the same thing: what lay within those walls. Was it simply a clinic where sickness ended in death, or was it something darker? A theater of experiment, where flesh was unstitched and souls extinguished in pursuit of forbidden knowledge? The house did not answer. It only watched, silent and unyielding, as the number of missing souls crept higher. In a valley where silence had become the language of survival, only fragments of truth ever surfaced. Stories passed like scraps of paper caught in the wind, half-heard confessions, hurried words spoken at the edge of lamplight. They were testimonies of families who had lost loved ones to the surgeon's care. Stories too incomplete to prove, but too haunting to forget. One woman, the sister of a vanished farmhand, claimed she had gone to the surgeon's house in desperation after her brother failed to return. She pounded on the locked front door until, finally, she heard movement inside. She swore she heard his voice, weak, trembling, but unmistakably his calling her name from somewhere deep within. Before she could cry out again, another sound smothered at a door slamming, followed by silence so suffocating she felt her ears ring. The surgeon eventually opened the door, his face calm, and told her she was mistaken. Her brother, he explained, had died hours earlier. He offered no body, no belongings, only a stare so cold she fled in terror. Another tale came from a boy of 12, who delivered candles to the surgeon's home one snowy evening. He insisted that when the cellar door opened, he glimpsed a row of wooden tables, each covered with sheets. Beneath one sheet, he thought he saw a hand slip free, pale, stiff, yet twitching as if still alive. The boy ran, candles tumbling from his basket, and never returned. His father scolded him for making up stories, but the boy refused to set foot near the surgeon's house again. A midwife in the town recalled a chilling detail of her own. She claimed that on nights when the surgeon took in patients, she often heard hurried footsteps on her porch long after midnight footsteps that paused, hesitated, and then vanished into the darkness. She wondered if these were patients trying to escape, or spirits trapped between worlds. But the most unsettling testimonies were not about sights or sounds. They were about absence itself. A father once remarked that after his son vanished, he sometimes awoke at night convinced he heard the boy breathing in the next room. Yet, when he rose to check, the bed was always empty. Another woman swore she smelled her daughter's perfume on the wind near the surgeon's house. Though her child had been declared dead weeks earlier, these fragments gnawed at the edges of sanity, leaving survivors unable to grieve properly. Without bodies, without proof, their minds played cruel tricks. Was it memory? Or was it something more? Despite these whispers, no one gathered them into a full accusation. Each testimony remained isolated, fragile, dismissed as grief or hysteria. The surgeon thrived in this fragmentation. He knew that families broken by loss rarely had the strength to unite. And so, each story remained just that, a story. Still, the fragments built a grim portrait when pieced together. Families recalled desperate knocks on locked doors, muffled cries cut short, and windows that glowed too brightly in the dead of night. Each account suggested not peaceful death, but struggle life smothered, stolen, or perhaps altered into something unrecognizable. Why, then, did the townsfolk never storm his home? Perhaps because the testimonies were too uncertain. Perhaps because fear of being wrong outweighed fear of being silent. Or perhaps because, in their hearts, they knew the truth would be unbearable. What would it mean to admit that a man they had trusted with their sick and dying had instead delivered them into horror? To accept such knowledge would be to admit their own complicity in allowing it to happen. The testimonies also carried a strange consistency, doors that would not open again. Survivors' families often described how once a loved one crossed the threshold of the surgeon's house. The door seemed to close with finality, as if sealing more than wood and iron. It sealed fate itself. Few dared even to knock afterward. The surgeon's refusal was always the same, polite but immovable. "It is for the best," he would say. And somehow those words ended every conversation. What were the muffled cries? What was dragged across the floors at night? Why did neighbors see shadows moving as if in struggle, yet never hear of recovery, only sudden decline? The fragments did not answer. They only raised more questions, questions that lingered in the valley like ghosts. Some swore the house itself was complicit. The locks seemed too strong, the walls too thick. Windows glowed with lamplight but never revealed more than vague shapes. The home had become a coffin for secrets, swallowing every testimony whole. And so the fragments remained just that, unjoined, unspoken in public, drifting like ash over a valley already drowning in dread. Were they enough to damn him? Perhaps, but without voices raised together, without courage forged from grief, they remained whispers. And whispers, however chilling, are easily ignored, especially by those who wish to survive another day. What is most terrifying in these stories is not what was seen, but what was heard for only a moment, then silenced forever. What happened behind that locked door after the muffled cries faded? What was the surgeon doing in those final moments his patients were heard alive? The fragments offered only glimpses, and glimpses can never fully satisfy. They leave the imagination to do the rest, and the imagination is often crueler than any truth. By the time spring of 1846 arrived, the whispers had grown darker still. No longer were people content to think of the surgeon as simply careless or cold. Instead, rumors thickened into something more grotesque that he was not healing at all, but experimenting. Whispers told of knives used not to cure, but to explore. Of bodies cut open while still alive, of blood drained and collected as if for study. The more the surgeon's patients disappeared, the more the valley began to believe he had strayed far beyond medicine into a realm both forbidden and obscene. Why would a man do such things? Some argued he was driven by ambition, a desire to rival the great anatomical discoveries of Europe. After all, medical colleges in Philadelphia and Boston hungered for knowledge, and cadavers were rare, often obtained illegally from grave robbers. Perhaps the surgeon wanted to make his name eternal, no matter the cost. Others whispered of something less human, that he had lost his soul in pursuit of secrets, that he sought to prolong life by tearing it apart, that he studied not illness, but the essence of existence itself. Fragments of evidence fueled the fire. One traveler claimed to have glimpsed strange glass jars lined along the surgeon's shelves, filled with pale shapes suspended in cloudy liquid. Another spoke of seeing books written in languages he did not recognize, with diagrams of bodies flayed and dissected in ways that seemed more ritual than scientific. A woman swore she found scraps of parchment discarded behind the house, notes written in a precise, looping hand that described nerve response under strain and the silence of breath before cessation. Could these have been misunderstandings, inventions of frightened minds? Perhaps, but in a community where fact and rumor blurred easily, the possibility alone was enough to terrify. There was also talk of sounds that no mere surgery could explain, metallic clanks that went on for hours, as though machines were being used in ways no farmer had ever seen. Groans that echoed not like cries of pain, but like low chants rising, falling, repeating. Some neighbors swore they smelled burning flesh carried on the night air, sharp and acrid, mixed with the chemical tang of alcohol and lime. These were not the smells of healing. They were the smells of alteration. And still, the surgeon's demeanor remained unchanged. He walked with steady steps, spoke with measured calm, and offered polite nods to anyone who dared meet his eyes. If there was madness in him, it was masked behind perfect composure. But perhaps that composure itself was the madness and ability to commit the unspeakable while appearing utterly ordinary. The valley split in its interpretation of his work. Some clung to the belief that he was still a man of medicine, that he experimented for knowledge, not cruelty. Others were certain he had crossed into heresy, treating human beings as mere materials for hidden trials. And then there were those who wondered if it was not his choice at all if he was compelled by something larger, some unseen force that demanded sacrifice in exchange for revelation. Were the 37 souls who vanished merely patients, or were they subjects? Was their disappearance the result of death, or of transformation into something unrecognizable? The rumors spread beyond the valley. Traders carried the tales to nearby towns, where they grew wilder with each telling. Some said the surgeon was building a new kind of man in his cellar, stitching parts together in defiance of God. Others claimed he was searching for a way to trap the soul, to pin it like an insect in glass so that it could be studied forever. And still others suggested he was not working alone, that secret societies of physicians paid him handsomely for the results of his experiments, results that never saw the light of day. What made the rumors most chilling was that they could not be disproven. With no bodies returned, no graves dug, the fate of the missing remained a blank canvas upon which every horror could be painted. And, in a sense, the absence itself became the proof. If the surgeon's work were innocent, why were there no remains? Why did every patient vanish entirely, leaving behind not even bones, The church, too, began to feel the weight of the rumors. Parishioners whispered that the surgeon's work reeked of sacrilege, that to cut into God's creation without reverence was to invite damnation. A deacon spoke once of confronting him, but when the moment came, he faltered beneath the surgeon's steady gaze. "He looked at me as though I were a specimen," the deacon later confessed, and in that moment, I felt smaller than a rat on a table. The valley was now steeped in dread, but also in fascination. Horror and curiosity walked hand in hand. People shunned the surgeon publicly, but privately they wondered what he knew, what he had seen, what truths he might have uncovered in his house of shadows. Could it be that he had glimpsed something beyond human comprehension? The rumors of experiments had transformed the surgeon from a man into a legend, a figure both feared and grotesquely respected. And as more vanished, the legend grew, fed by silence, stitched together from fragments of fear. But legends are dangerous things. They can consume a community, twisting fear into inevitability. And in that Pennsylvania valley, the question was no longer whether the surgeon was guilty. It was how far he was willing to go and how many more souls he would take with him. By the middle of 1846, the whispered count of vanished souls had reached 37. It was a number too great to ignore, a tally that no town of modest size could conceal without consequence. Every family, it seemed, had been touched either directly or by a neighbor's tragedy. And yet, when the matter arose in conversation, the same dreadful silence would fall, as though the number itself carried a curse. To speak it aloud was to admit complicity, and worse, to invite whatever fate had befallen those who entered the surgeon's care. 37 souls, and not a single grave. 37 souls, and not a single coffin lowered into the earth. Not a single stone carved to bear a name. It was as if they had been erased from existence. Mothers clutched at memories. Fathers clung to fragments of belongings left behind. Children grew up repeating names of siblings who had never been properly mourned. The town became a graveyard without markers, haunted not by what was seen, but by what was missing. It was around this time that the surgeon's home began to draw attention from those beyond the valley. Strangers, reporters, clergymen, even traveling physicians arrived after hearing rumors of a doctor whose patients never returned. They came with questions, with pens ready to record, with prayers to drive out evil, but each visitor left unsettled, their inquiries smothered by the surgeon's calm explanations. He spoke with authority, cloaked his work in medical jargon, and dismissed every accusation as misunderstanding. Medicine, he would say, is not a field for the faint of heart. Some outcomes are less palatable, but necessary. And somehow, this always ended the conversation. Yet the evidence of absence persisted. A young clerk from a nearby town, intrigued by the rumors, attempted to create a list of names. He visited grieving families, writing down details of the lost Eliza Harper, Thomas Bell, Caleb Yates, and many more. But when he returned weeks later to gather the final accounts, his notes had vanished. The ledger, kept under lock in his boarding house, was gone without a trace. The clerk, shaken, abandoned his project. He told others that the valley itself seemed determined to protect its silence. Among the townsfolk, a strange duality took hold. By day, they avoided the surgeon, crossing streets rather than meet his gaze. By night, they gathered in kitchens and barns, speaking in hushed tones about the number 37. Some believed the surgeon had a hidden pit behind his house, filled with bones. Others were certain he sent his victims' remains to secret buyers in the city. But the most chilling rumor was that there were no remains at all, that whatever he did within those walls left nothing behind, not even ash. The psychological weight of the missing began to transform the community itself. Farmers, who once traded goods freely, now guarded their barns with suspicion, Women carried charms of iron or silver, believing they might ward off the surgeon's gaze. Children grew up fearing not wolves in the woods, but the polished man with the black bag who walked the roads at dusk. 37 became a number carved into the marrow of the valley, a number that meant doom. It is worth asking why 37, why not 36 or 38? Some suggested the number itself held significance. In the Bible, 3 and 7 were numbers of divine weight completion, judgment, the end of cycles. Was the surgeon following some hidden arithmetic, marking his work with a signature too obscure for ordinary people to read? Or had the count simply paused at 37 because something else intervened, because fate itself had decided the tally could go no further? No answer ever surfaced, only questions. And the questions themselves became part of the haunting. Each family counted differently. Each tally whispered in private circles, but the result was always the same: 37 gone. 37 never returned. As the number spread beyond the valley, the surgeon's legend darkened further. He was no longer merely a doctor with unfortunate outcomes. He was a specter of disappearance, a figure invoked to frighten children into obedience. Stay close, mothers warned, or the surgeon will take you, and you will vanish like the 37. His name became synonymous with erasure. And yet, in his calm, he continued as though untouched by rumor. He visited markets, purchased supplies, spoke with distant politeness. When asked about the disappearances, he only tilted his head, as though perplexed that anyone might doubt his word. Illness, he would say, claims more than we wish. Medicine is imperfect. His eyes, however, told a different story, eyes that measured, eyes that remembered. The final tally of 37 hung over the town like a death knell, an unsolvable equation carved into their history. With no graves, no bodies, no justice, the valley became a place of ghosts that were never buried. And so the silence deepened. The surgeon's legend solidified, not through evidence but through absence. 37 souls gone, and with them, the last threads of innocence in a Pennsylvania town that history itself seemed eager to forget. But legends do not end with numbers. They echo. And the question that lingered, one that chills even now, was this: what if 37 was only the beginning? Just as the whispers reached their loudest pitch, just as neighbors began to wonder if the silence could hold any longer, the surgeon himself vanished. One morning, the shutters of his farmhouse remained closed. No smoke rose from the chimney. No lantern flickered at dusk. Days passed, then weeks, with no sign of the man who had once walked so steadily through their streets. The house of shadows stood silent at last, and in its silence, the valley trembled with both relief and dread. Some believed he had fled. Perhaps the whispers had grown too strong, and he anticipated that the town would soon rise against him. Others speculated that he had been taken away by some secret society, his knowledge too valuable to lose. A few dared whisper an even darker thought that he had not fled at all, but been claimed by whatever force had driven his work. After all, how could a man who had erased 37 souls expect to escape erasure himself when a group of men finally gathered the courage to enter his home? They found it abandoned but not empty. The parlor was neat, a stack of medical journals on the table. The kitchen contained untouched food, slowly spoiling. Upstairs, the beds were stripped bare, but in the study and cellar, the true remnants of his life emerged. Surgical instruments lay in careful rows, gleaming even in the dust. Scalpels, saws, and clamps, tools of medicine, yet also tools of horror when used without consent. Alongside them were notebooks, bound in leather, filled with precise handwriting. The entries were clinical, detached, and chilling: subject, expired after 3 incisions. Reaction to pressure inconsistent. Respiration ceased during procedure. Specimen not recovered. Never names, only subject. Never compassion, only data. Most disturbing were the drawings, sketched in graphite. They depicted human figures opened like diagrams, organs labeled, veins traced, as if anatomy were a puzzle to be solved rather than a life to be preserved. Some images strayed beyond anatomy, resembling grotesque hybrids' limbs twisted at impossible angles, eyes drawn too large, torsos joined unnaturally. Were these imagined, or were they faithful records of what he had done? No one wished to linger on the question. In the cellar, jars lined the shelves. Some were empty, their lids clouded with residue. Others contained unrecognizable fragments suspended in yellowing liquid. A few appeared to hold organs, though shriveled with time. The stench drove many men back up the stairs, gagging. Those who remained insisted the cellar was wrong in some deeper sense. The air felt too heavy, as if pressing on their chests. One man claimed he heard faint echoes, like whispers trapped in the walls. Another swore a jar shifted on its own, though no one touched it. They left quickly, sealing the door behind them. Yet, for all the horror they discovered, they found no trace of the surgeon himself. His bed had been unused for nights. His coat still hung on its peg. His medical bag, that ever-present companion, rested by the desk. It was as though he had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. Theories flourished. Some believed he had staged his disappearance, abandoning his work once it grew too dangerous. Others insisted the valley itself had consumed him, just as it had his patients, the silence finally turning inward. A few spoke of retribution, that the spirits of the 37 had risen at last and dragged him into the same darkness he had forced upon them. Whatever the truth, the surgeon's vanishing left the valley with a paradox. Relief washed over the town. No more patients vanished, no more screams echoed in the night. Yet unease remained, for his absence provided no answers. The journals revealed fragments of method, but not motive. The cellar revealed grotesque remains, but not the fates of the 37. The surgeon was gone, but his shadow endured. The house stood for years after, abandoned and rotting. Windows broke, shutters hung loose, ivy crawled over its walls. Travelers passing through sometimes dared to step inside, but few lingered. Some swore they heard footsteps in the empty halls, or caught glimpses of figures moving just beyond their lantern light. One man claimed to hear muffled cries echoing from the cellar, though the shelves had long since been cleared. The House of Shadows, it seemed, had absorbed too much to ever be silent again. What became of the surgeon? Did he flee into another town, another valley, to continue his work under a new name? Did he perish in the woods? His body swallowed by earth, his secrets buried forever, or was his disappearance part of the same pattern? He created a final act of erasure, leaving no body, no grave, no closure. The valley never knew. They were left only with absence, an absence as profound and terrible as the 37 who had gone before him. And in that absence, the legend hardened into stone. The surgeon was no longer just a man. He was a story, a warning, a figure invoked when silence grew too heavy, when shadows stretched too long. When a loved one disappeared without reason, in the end, perhaps his vanishing was inevitable. For a man who erased so many, what fate could be more fitting than to vanish himself, leaving behind nothing but questions decades slipped past, and the surgeon's story became less a memory than a haunting inheritance. Children who had once been hushed at night with warnings, "Stay inside," or the surgeon will take you grew into adults who repeated the same to their own children. The valley itself changed, new farms rose, old barns collapsed, families moved in and out. Yet the legend remained, stitched into the soil like an invisible root. Whenever strangers asked why the town seemed wary, why its people grew silent at nightfall, the answer was never direct. They only shook their heads and muttered that their valley had once been cursed by a man of medicine. the number 37 persisted like a scar. It appeared in sermons as a metaphor, in cautionary tales told around fires, even in songs whispered by children. No one could agree on the details, but everyone knew the essence 37 entered. None returned. The surgeon vanished, leaving no body, no trial, no justice. And so the absence itself became the inheritance. As the century turned, a new generation of curious minds sought to reopen the tale. Amateur historians, newspapermen, and folklorists visited the valley, hoping to uncover the truth. They searched courthouse archives, but records were strangely incomplete. Church ledgers skipped years. Tax rolls bore the surgeon's name once, then never again. It was as though someone had scrubbed his existence from paper, leaving only rumor behind. One researcher interviewed the elderly who still remembered. Their testimonies were frail but chilling. A woman in her 80s recalled seeing jars in the cellar, their contents moving faintly as though alive. A toothless man muttered about screams carried on winter winds, screams that froze the livestock where they stood. Another swore he once saw the surgeon himself in the woods years after his disappearance, walking calmly, as if time had never touched him. But whenever these researchers pressed too hard, the townsfolk grew uneasy. They warned the curious not to dig too deeply, not for fear of scandal, but because some knowledge was better left buried. "We've lived with the silence this long," one farmer told them. "If you stir it up, it may come back." And so the legend hardened further. Some claimed the surgeon had been a pioneer of modern medicine, too advanced for his time, misunderstood by simple farmers. Others insisted he was a butcher, a heretic who had bargained with death. A few whispered he was neither, that he had glimpsed something beyond human comprehension and had simply stepped into it, leaving behind a shadow that never fully faded. The house of shadows eventually collapsed into ruin, consumed by ivy and time. Children dared each other to step into its remains, though few stayed long. They returned pale-faced, speaking of cold draughts that whispered their names, of shapes moving in the corners even when the sun was bright. The cellar, half buried and rotting, was said to exhale a smell of damp earth mixed with something metallic. No one ever rebuilt there. The land seemed unwilling to be reclaimed. Yet the questions persisted, circling endlessly like carrion birds. What became of the 37 were they dissected, burned? Hidden beneath the soil, did the surgeons sell their remains, or use them for experiments too strange to name? And what of his disappearance? Was it flight, murder, or something far stranger? Each generation asked, and each received only silence in return. Perhaps that was the cruelest legacy of all, not the blood, not the horror, but the silence that lingered. For silence itself is a kind of ghost, filling every space where truth should be. And so the tale endures, half legend, half warning. In Pennsylvania, there was once a surgeon whose patients vanished. His tally was 37, though some whisper the number was higher. He himself disappeared, leaving only questions behind. And the valley, even now, cannot quite breathe free of his shadow. What do you believe really happened? Were those 37 souls the victims of madness, of science gone astray, or of something even darker, something that cannot be named? Share your thoughts below, for these stories live on not in history books, but in the questions we dare to ask. If you wish to walk further into forgotten corridors of America's past, subscribe for more stories history tried to erase. And if the silence of the surgeon still lingers with you, continue watching this video, hear another tale of the shadows that still cling to our soil,